Welcome to Reformed Thinking. It usually happens on a Sunday evening.
Oh, I know that routine well.
Right. You sit down on the couch, you pull out your smartphone, and you open up the calendar app.
And you see all those neat, color-coded time blocks stretching right across the week ahead of you.
It is visually so satisfying. I mean, blue is for your morning project meetings.
Green is for those gym sessions you desperately hope to actually make.
Yeah, and yellow is for family obligations, dinner dates, whatever it is. And looking at that glowing screen, you get this subtle, really intoxicating feeling.
Like you are the undisputed master of your reality.
Precisely. You built the schedule, you slotted in the tasks, and you just assume the week will naturally fall in line accordingly.
Until Tuesday morning hits.
Yes. Tuesday hits, and a pipe bursts in your kitchen, completely flooding the floor.
Or your boss moves a massive deadline up by 3 days out of nowhere.
Or your car battery just dies in the driveway. And suddenly, that neat digital calendar feels like a huge, ridiculous joke.
Because we live our entire lives in this constant, agonizing tension between the precise plans we make and the chaotic reality that actually unfolds.
So true. And today, we're taking a deep dive into a theological concept that touches every single decision you make.
Every plan you draw up, and really every unexpected setback you face.
We are looking at comprehensive historical and biblical texts, analyzing the intersection of divine sovereignty and human autonomy.
And our mission today is to reconcile our daily planning, choosing, and acting with a creator who governs all things.
Right, and we want to see why understanding this truth is actually the absolute best source of comfort you could ever possess.
Rather than a reason for dread or anxiety.
But to do that properly, we really need to establish a clear baseline. Like, how do the historical confessions define the scope of God's involvement in the world?
Well, a lot of modern people, even those sitting in church pews every week, they operate under a sort of deistic framework.
The whole clockmaker idea.
That is right. They assume God wound the universe up like a giant grandfather clock, set the physical laws in motion, and then took several giant steps back to just watch it all unfold.
But the texts we are evaluating today flat out reject that hands-off approach. The baseline definition we find in the Westminster Confession is that the Creator upholds, directs, disposes, and governs all creatures, actions, and things.
From the greatest even to the least.
Right. He does not just observe from a distance, wringing his hands and hoping we decide to cooperate with his suggestions.
He is actively directing every atom and every human action toward an appointed definite end.
And that phrase, from the greatest even to the least, is staggering when you consider what it means.
It means his governance applies to the orbit of Jupiter just as much as it applies to the dust floating in a shaft of sunlight in your living room.
Wow. But instead of starting with cosmic macro-level theology regarding the rise and fall of empires, we should start where we all live.
Our daily schedules.
Yeah. If we look at the letter of James, specifically the 4th chapter, we find an incredibly vivid illustration of this exact conflict between human planning and divine reality.
James is writing to early Jewish Christians who are scattered throughout the Greco-Roman world.
And he zeroes in on a very specific demographic within that community.
Affluent, itinerant merchants operating within the Pax Romana.
And the historical context here is crucial for us to grasp. This was an era of unprecedented Mediterranean peace and infrastructure.
The Romans had paved thousands of miles of roads.
They cleared the shipping lanes of pirates.
Right. They created an economic environment where international commerce could just thrive across vast distances with relative safety.
So these merchants, they're basically the first century equivalent of modern corporate executives.
Racking up frequent flyer miles, moving from city to city, closing deals.
Yes, and Jilts quotes the kind of boardroom speech they were just tossing around. He writes, "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow you will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit."
When you isolate the specific verbs in that statement, the sheer arrogance of it jumps right off the page.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they claim complete, unchallenged authority over time by saying today or tomorrow.
They claim absolute authority over geographic location with the phrase, such and such a town.
They dictate the duration of their lives by saying they will spend a year there.
They assume the ability to perform the activity, which is trade.
And they totally guarantee the economic outcome, declaring they will make a profit.
But what is most revealing about their speech is what is entirely absent from it.
God.
Spot on. There is zero mention of God. The issue James is attacking here is not that they are involved in commerce
Right. He's not condemning free enterprise.
or the act of diligent, careful planning. He is attacking their posture.
They're operating as practical atheists.
Yes, they might attend synagogue or church. They might confess belief in a creator on the Sabbath, but on Monday morning in the marketplace,
They live and speak as if God does not exist.
that is the core issue.
I was actually thinking on an analogy for this kind of practical atheism. It reminds me of a 6-year-old child sitting on the floor of the house
Okay.
with a box of crayons, drawing up elaborate architectural blueprints to knock down the load-bearing walls and completely remodel the family living room.
Oh, that is a great image.
Right. The child's planning isn't the problem. Having an active imagination is great.
But the problem is the total disregard for the true authority of the house.
Exactly. I mean, spot on. The child is completely ignoring the fact that the parents actually own the property.
They hold the mortgage.
They understand the structural engineering.
And they control the entire budget.
Yeah, the child assumes an ownership and a capability they simply do not possess.
That captures the delusion perfectly. The child is claiming a sovereignty they do not have the capacity to wield.
And James confronts these ancient businessmen by attacking their assumption of ownership over their own biological existence.
He initiates a complete linguistic teardown of their pride. In verse 14, he asks them a blunt question. What is your life?
And he answers it using the Greek word atmos.
Which translates to a mist or a vapor.
It is the steam rising off a hot cup of coffee that vanishes into the cold morning air.
Right. These businessmen are acting like they possess concrete permanence.
They speak as if they are fixed, immovable mountains of industry.
They act like their calendars are etched in stone.
But biologically, fundamentally, James says they are a vanishing vapor. They do not even know what tomorrow will bring.
Let alone what their profit margins will be a full year from now.
This is a devastating critique of human self-sufficiency.
It really is. James demands a complete psychological and grammatical shift in how they view their existence. He tells them, instead you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that.
The order of that sentence is so fascinating to me. He does not just say, if the Lord wills, we will make a profit.
No, he backs the dependence all the way up to biological existence itself.
If the Lord wills, we will live. The conditional clause governs the next heartbeat before it governs the success of the business trip.
It shifts the base level assumption of tomorrow from being a guaranteed right to being a borrowed gift.
You cannot guarantee your next breath. The natural human action of waking up tomorrow is completely dependent on the sovereign decree of the Creator.
And to plan without acknowledging that absolute dependence is a severe offense, James delivers a very harsh verdict in verse 16.
He does not call it a mild oversight.
Or bad manners?
No, he calls it arrogant boasting and declares that all such boasting is evil.
It is evil because they are attempting a coup. They are trying to steal the throne of the universe.
They are trying to claim a level of sovereign control that belongs exclusively to the Creator.
That is right.
So we have established that God's sovereign sway covers our mundane travel plans, our daily commerce, and our biological existence.
The micro-level stuff.
Right. But this immediately forces us to ask how this scales up. It is one thing to say God manages a merchant's calendar. Does he also direct the highest echelons of human authority?
Does he control the dictators, the emperors, and the massive geopolitical movements of history?
Yeah, if he governs the merchant in the market, logic demands we ask if he governs the monarch on the throne.
To answer that, we have to look at the wisdom literature, specifically Proverbs chapter 21, verse 1.
Which says, "The king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he will."
We really need to build out the historical context for the original readers to grasp the weight of that statement.
Because in the ancient Near East, a king was not a modern politician.
No, they didn't have to worry about approval ratings or term limits.
Or a system of checks and balances. Kings like the pharaohs in Egypt, or the emperors of Assyria, or Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, they were unrestrained autocrats.
Their spoken word was absolute law. They held the terrifying authority of life and death over thousands of people in a single breath.
In many of those cultures, the king was practically worshipped as a living deity.
The subjects believed the king's will was the ultimate determining force in the universe. In the entire hierarchy of human agency, there was no will more autonomous, no decree more final.
And no power more intimidating than that of an ancient absolute monarch.
So think about the massive logical tension here.
Put yourself in the shoes of an ancient Israelite reading this proverb. You are a small, vulnerable nation surrounded by these massive, bloodthirsty empires.
The Assyrians were famous for flaying their enemies alive.
And stacking skulls outside conquered cities.
Yes.
So if an Assyrian dictator had that kind of unbridled, terrifying authority, how on earth does the original reader reconcile the sheer terror they feel toward that approaching army with the idea that God is somehow holding that wicked dictator's heart?
The answer lies in the specific mechanism Solomon uses in his metaphor.
Okay, let's look at that.
When the proverb says the king's heart is a stream of water, the Hebrew word used is peleg.
Peleg.
Now, a modern reader might mistakenly picture a wild, raging, uncontrollable river bursting its banks and destroying everything in its path.
But Peleg does not refer to a wild river.
No, it specifically refers to a small, manually cut irrigation canal.
Oh, wow. That drastically changes the imagery. A king thinks he is a tidal wave, but the text calls him an agricultural ditch.
That is an amazing way to put it. In
Yeah.
ancient farming, a worker would dig these small parallel channels in the dirt to water a field.
Right.
And to direct the water from the main source to a specific row of crops, the farmer did not need heavy machinery. He didn't need massive dams.
He would just walk out into the field.
And use his bare foot to kick some dirt to block one channel and drag his heel to open another.
And the water flowed effortlessly and precisely where the farmer intended.
The king is convinced he is a sovereign force of nature, completely independent, but the text reveals he's just an irrigation canal in the dirt.
And the foot of Yahweh is effortlessly directing his course. That is a staggering demotion for the ego of a king.
And the text says God turns it wherever he will. It is complete unilateral control.
The Hebrew syntax drives that home too, right?
It does. The phrase wherever he will is kol asher yachpatz. This is a technical theological phrase denoting the unrestricted absolute delight and sovereignty of God.
It means all that he pleases.
The direction of the most intimidating human will on earth is determined entirely by the unilateral pleasure of the Creator. God does not negotiate with kings. He directs them.
And we do not just have this as a poetic theory. We see concrete historical proofs of this directed heart throughout the ancient records.
Look at the Exodus narrative.
Yeah, the Egyptians had enslaved the Israelites for centuries, subjecting them to horrific cruelty and genocide.
The resentment and hatred toward the Israelites was entrenched.
Yet God declared to Moses that he would grant Israel favor in the sight of the Egyptians.
And what happens? When it was finally time to leave, the Egyptians willingly handed over their silver, their gold, and their clothing to the departing slaves.
God took the hostile hearts of bitter enemies and inclined them to become compliant benefactors to fund the building of the Israelite tabernacle.
It's incredible. Or consider Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. He was a ruthless, arrogant, pagan conqueror.
But the biblical texts actually refer to this tyrant as God's servant and his hammer.
God used Nebuchadnezzar's own sinful lust for geopolitical conquest as a disciplinary tool against the rebellious nation of Judah.
Nebuchadnezzar thought he was building his own glory, but he was actually executing the precise judgment decreed by Yahweh.
And generations later, we see the exact opposite action with Cyrus the Persian.
Right, Cyrus was another pagan conqueror who overtook the Babylonian Empire.
Yet, to fulfill the prophetic words spoken decades earlier by Isaiah and Jeremiah, God stirred the spirit of Cyrus.
God inclined this pagan king's heart to release the Jewish captives.
He returned the plundered gold vessels of the temple.
And decreed that the house of God be rebuilt in Jerusalem using royal funds.
A man who did not even worship Yahweh opened his imperial treasury to fund the rebuilding of Yahweh's temple.
Because his heart was a canal, and God directed the water exactly where it needed to go.
These historical events prove that human political might is an illusion of control on a massive scale.
Whether it is Pharaoh's stubbornness, Nebuchadnezzar's pride, or Cyrus's generosity, the natural human will is consistently bent to achieve the divine purpose.
Always.
Okay, so I buy that God can shape a king's geopolitical borders like an irrigation canal. He can move armies and change the course of history through external circumstances.
Yes.
But this brings us to a massive logical wall. Moving an army or granting favor is one thing. But if God is actually inside the human mind, determining the internal choices we make,
Doesn't the whole concept of human agency, love, and willing just collapse?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are we just talking about God changing circumstances so people react differently, or does he actually direct the internal mechanism of human choice itself?
You have just hit the theological deep end.
Right.
To address the internal mechanism of the will, we really have to look at the letter to the Romans, specifically chapter 9.
The Apostle Paul is addressing a massive, heartbreaking theological crisis in the first century here.
The widespread unbelief of ethnic Israel.
The Jewish people possessed the covenants, the giving of the law, the temple worship, and the promises of the patriarchs.
Yet, as the gospel spread, the vast majority of ethnic Israelites were rejecting Jesus as the Messiah, while pagan Gentiles were flooding into the early church.
And the obvious question Paul is anticipating from his readers is this: has the word of God failed?
If the chosen people are rejecting the Messiah, did God's massive redemptive plan somehow derail?
Did the human will of Israel successfully thwart the divine decree?
Paul's answer to that is a resounding, aggressive no.
He reaches back into the patriarchal history of Genesis to prove that God's electing purposes are not, and have never been, bound by human lineage.
Or tradition, or human effort. And this argument climaxes in Romans chapter 9, verse 16, which states, "So then it depends not on human will or exertion, but on God who has mercy."
Let's analyze the logic Paul is employing here.
Yeah.
Because how does he structure this argument regarding the internal will?
Paul builds this argument using an inferential conjunction in the original language. He says consequently or therefore.
Okay.
He is stating a watertight, undeniable logical conclusion based on the historical evidence of how God chose Isaac over Ishmael.
And Jacob over Esau before they were even born or had done anything good or bad.
And to drive the point home, Paul uses a double negation to completely strip away any ground for human boasting.
A double negation. What specific things is he denying?
He explicitly denies the two core components of human agency. First, he says salvation is not of the willing one.
Okay, so that targets our internal desire, our volition, our cognitive choosing.
Second, he says it is nor of the running one.
Which targets our external effort, our moral striving, our religious actions.
Paul takes both internal desire and external effort, places them on the table, and explicitly removes them from the driver's seat of salvation.
And the pivot he makes immediately after that double negation is total. He replaces human action with a single divine attribute.
He says it depends entirely of the mercy-showing God.
The active sovereign mercy of the Creator is the sole determining factor in who receives grace.
Yes, the text is unambiguous. The decisive factor in human redemption is not the human exercising his will to choose God. It is God exercising his mercy to choose the human.
I have to step in here and formulate the absolute strongest objection to this, because this is the exact spot where someone listening is going to feel a spike of frustration.
It is a hard concept.
If my internal willing and my external running are explicitly denied as the decisive factors of my own salvation, then how are human beings anything more than unthinking machines?
Right.
If God's mercy is the sole uncaused cause of my choosing, where is my responsibility? How can a judge condemn a criminal if the judge wrote the script for the crime?
That is the most common and vital philosophical objection. And Paul actually anticipates that exact pushback a few verses later.
He writes, "You will say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who can resist his will?"
To answer this, we have to understand the biblical doctrine of total depravity. We make the mistake of assuming the natural human will is a neutral faculty.
Right, we picture the human mind as this perfectly balanced set of scales,
Standing in a neutral room.
objectively weighing the options between choosing God and choosing sin, completely free from any bias.
But that neutral room does not exist. The texts are clear about the natural state of the human mind after the fall.
In 1 Corinthians chapter 2, it states that the natural person does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are folly to him.
And he is not able to understand them. In Romans chapter 8, it says the mindset on the flesh is hostile to God.
For it does not submit to God's law. Indeed, it cannot.
So the will is not neutral. It is actively hostile.
It is bound by its own corruption.
Correct. The natural human will is in bondage to its corrupted nature. A person always chooses according to their strongest desire at the moment of choice.
Left entirely to itself, the natural will freely, happily, and constantly chooses rebellion against its maker.
It chooses exactly what it desires, and what it desires is sin. Therefore, God does not violate a pristine neutral will when he intervenes.
He overcomes a hostile, rebellious one.
This brings us to the philosophical concept of compatibilism.
For the listener trying to grasp how God can determine the outcome while man makes a real choice, we really need to break down the mechanism.
Because orchestrating a choice and forcing a choice feel like a distinction without a difference to a lot of people.
So how are they actually different?
Compatibilism is the position that God's absolute meticulous sovereignty and human moral responsibility are fully compatible.
Even if our finite minds cannot perfectly map the intersection.
The mechanism is vital to understand. God does not violate the human will mechanically. He does not force a person to choose against their own desires.
Dragging them kicking and screaming into a decision they hate.
Instead, he is the master of secondary causes.
Let me test an analogy here. Think of a brilliant author writing a complex novel, say Shakespeare writing Macbeth.
Okay, good example.
Shakespeare determines the exact beginning, middle, and end of the play. The outcome is predestined by the author.
But within the world of the play, Macbeth acts entirely according to his own ambitions.
His own paranoia, his own fears.
No.
Macbeth makes real choices. He commits real murders.
And he is morally culpable for his actions within the narrative.
Shakespeare wrote the betrayal, but Shakespeare did not commit the betrayal.
The character acted freely according to his nature, while the author sovereignly ordained the story.
That feels like a very helpful way to frame it.
It is. God sovereignly orchestrates the desires, the historical circumstances, the environments, and the inclinations of individuals.
So that they freely, without any external coercion, choose exactly what his hand had predestined.
We make real choices. We experience the weight of those choices, and we are held morally accountable for them.
But God's sovereign decree is the ultimate umbrella under which those secondary causes operate.
We have to move this from abstract philosophy to concrete history, though.
Right. Where do we see this flawless execution of compatibilism in actual historical reality? Because if this staggering claim is true, that God orchestrates circumstances so hostile humans freely choose what he predestined, there has to be a monumental demonstration of it.
The absolute, irrefutable demonstration of this providence is the trial and crucifixion of Jesus Christ.
If you look at the historical record in the book of Acts, specifically chapter 4, you see this exact dynamic explained by the early church.
Let's set the scene in Jerusalem during the final hours of Christ's life.
You have a massive collision of political, religious, and social forces. You have King Herod, who is disappointed that Jesus won't perform a magic trick for him.
So he mocks him and sends him away.
You have Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, who examines Jesus and declares him entirely innocent of any crime.
But Pilate is terrified of a Jewish riot ruining his political career, so he cowardly sentences an innocent man to a brutal death.
You have the Gentile soldiers executing the physical violence, driving the nails out of sheer callous duty.
And you have the religious leaders and the mob screaming for blood out of deep-seated theological envy and hatred.
Look at the psychological motivations you just listed. Herod's flippant mockery.
Pilate's political cowardice.
The soldiers' brutal apathy.
The crowd's vicious hatred. Every single one of those actors operated freely.
Pilate was not possessed. He made a calculated, self-serving political choice.
Judas betrayed Jesus freely out of his own natural greed for 30 pieces of silver.
No one held a metaphysical gun to their heads, forcing them to sin.
They chose exactly what their wicked hearts most strongly desired in that moment.
But listen to the theological synthesis the early believers arrive at when they pray about this event in Acts chapter 4.
They lift their voices and note that Herod, Pilate, the Gentiles, and the peoples of Israel were gathered together against Jesus.
But then they say this to God. They gathered to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place.
That statement completely dismantles the charge of fatalism or that God is the author of evil.
The worst, most heinous sin ever committed in human history, the torturing and crucifying of the completely innocent, spotless Son of God, was carried out by free, natural, uncoerced human choices.
The humans were fully responsible for their wickedness. Yet in their free willing and acting, they accomplished the exact, meticulous, redemptive plan of God ordained from eternity past.
God did not inject fresh evil into Pilate's heart.
God simply arranged the historical circumstances so that Pilate's natural cowardice would result in the exact decree God intended.
He used the secondary causes of human sin to achieve the primary cause of global salvation. That is brilliant.
And when you look at the posture of Christ himself during those hours in the Garden of Gethsemane, the contrast with the affluent merchants from James chapter 4 is absolute night and day.
Walk us through that psychological contrast.
Well, think about the merchants sitting around a table in a comfortable inn, boasting about their future profits.
We will go. We will spend a year. We will make money.
It is total self-sufficiency. They are claiming tomorrow as their property.
But then look at Jesus in the garden. He is facing unspeakable physical agony and the horror of bearing divine wrath.
He is sweating drops of blood.
He have the authority to call down legions of angels to stop the process. But what does he say?
Not my will, but yours be done.
Jesus is the only man in history who lived his entire life under the correct, flawless posture of providence.
Where Adam grasped for autonomy and control in the Garden of Eden, Jesus completely surrendered his autonomy in the Garden of Gethsemane.
He is the perfect exemplar of the teaching of James. He entrusted tomorrow entirely to the Father, even when tomorrow meant the cross.
And because he did, he secures the grace necessary for us to be rescued from the bondage of our own autonomy.
Which brings in the interaction Jesus has with the rich young ruler in the Gospel of Luke.
Right, the ruler comes to Jesus asking how to inherit eternal life.
Jesus tells him to sell all his possessions.
The text says the ruler walks away very sad because he was extremely wealthy.
He loves his money more than he loves the Messiah.
Yeah.
His natural will cannot and will not choose Christ over his bank account.
The disciples are watching this incredible moral failure happen, and they are terrified. They ask, then who can be saved?
They recognize that if a moral, law-abiding, earnest young man cannot overcome his own corrupt desires to choose God, no one has a chance.
And Jesus looks at them and delivers the definitive statement on divine grace. What is impossible with man is possible with God.
That is the core of redemptive governance. It is a biological and spiritual impossibility for the natural human will to save itself.
It is like trying to force a literal camel through the microscopic eye of a sewing needle.
The camel cannot do it, and the needle cannot accommodate it.
But God's sovereign providence is the only force capable of overcoming the bondage of our natural will.
He does not wait for the heart of stone to start beating on its own.
He removes the heart of stone, replaces it with a heart of flesh, and places his spirit within us,
causing the rebel to willingly, freely, and joyfully embrace the Savior they previously hated.
He changes the fundamental nature so that the strongest desire becomes Christ.
So we have covered the macro level of kings and the micro level of the human will.
But we need to land the plane for the listener right now.
Right. If the King of Kings holds the hearts of modern dictators, the hearts of difficult employers, and the minds of angry mobs in his hands today, how should this radically alter the way you live this coming Monday morning?
We must bring this into the daily application of our lives. The historical texts demand a concrete response.
And the very first application is the total dismantling of the modern idol of control.
We touched on this at the very beginning with the calendar app, but the psychological obsession goes so much deeper in our contemporary culture.
We're utterly obsessed with mastery. We genuinely believe that if we gather enough data, we can eliminate vulnerability.
We try to control our biological health through wearable technology that tracks every heart rate spike and REM sleep cycle,
hoping we can outsmart mortality.
We try to control our social perception through carefully curated personal brands on social media, managing our image like a PR firm.
We try to insulate our finances with complex algorithms and diversified portfolios.
We act as if enough technique and enough planning can render us bulletproof.
But James demolishes that fantasy. He says, you do not know what tomorrow will bring.
No financial spreadsheet can secure your life against a global market crash.
No fitness tracker can prevent a sudden cellular mutation.
And acknowledging that we are a mist, that we are fundamentally vulnerable and dependent, is actually incredibly liberating.
Liberating? I think for a lot of people listening, the idea of losing control sounds terrifying, not liberating. How is recognizing our powerlessness a good thing?
It is liberating because you are freed from the exhausting, crushing psychological burden of pretending to be self-sovereign.
Wow. If you believe you are entirely responsible for securing your future, the anxiety will eventually eat you alive.
You will lie awake at night wondering what variable you forgot to calculate.
But if you recognize that your life, your actions, and your timeline are governed by a wise, holy, and fatherly God who numbers the hairs on your head, you can lay that massive burden down.
You still plan, you still work hard at your job, you still exercise, but you do it with open hands, trusting the ultimate outcome to him.
Okay, I can see how that applies to business plans or health anxieties. But let me ask a very specific, painful question regarding suffering. When someone is wronged by another person, say, a boss who maliciously slanders them and ruins their career, or a spouse who betrays them in the worst, most intimate way possible,
it is incredibly easy to feel entirely victimized by someone else's autonomous free will.
the pain feels random and senseless. So how does this doctrine of meticulous providence act as a healing balm in those specific moments of agonizing betrayal?
That is where the rubber meets the road in Christian theology. When we look at the historical account of Joseph in the book of Genesis, we see this exact scenario play out.
Joseph was betrayed by his own brothers. They threw him into a pit, contemplated murdering him, and then sold him into human trafficking.
He was taken to Egypt, falsely accused of sexual assault by his master's wife, and left to rot in a dungeon for years.
All of those horrific events were driven by the wicked, natural wills of other human beings.
Joseph had every human right to be consumed with bitterness, cynicism, and a burning desire for revenge against the brothers who ruined his youth. But decades later, through a series of providential events, Joseph becomes the second most powerful man in Egypt.
His brothers are starving due to a famine, and they come begging for food.
Joseph holds the authority of life and death over the men who trafficked him. And what does he say to them in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20?
He says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good."
The phrasing there is absolutely critical. He did not say, you did something terrible and God scrambled to fix it after the fact.
He did not say God simply used a random tragic accident to teach a lesson.
Right. He uses the same verb for both parties. He said God meant it.
The human agents were fully responsible for their sin, and their intentions were entirely malicious.
But behind their wicked secondary actions stood the flawless, loving, primary intention of a father orchestrating history for Joseph's ultimate good.
And the physical preservation of a nation during a famine.
When you are betrayed or slandered, the human agent is morally responsible for their sin.
But they could not lift a single finger against you. They could not speak a single lie about you unless it was granted to them from heaven.
That truth allows you to process deep pain without giving way to hopeless despair.
Because you know your suffering is never meaningless chaos. It is a severe mercy.
That is a staggering comfort for anyone walking through a season of grief or betrayal.
And this doctrine also completely changes how we face a broader culture that feels increasingly hostile to the truth.
We see a strong temptation in modern religious circles toward pragmatism.
Churches try to manipulate the natural human will through slick marketing tactics, emotional coercion, concert-style lighting, or watering down the hard truths of the text to make it more palatable to a secular audience.
Pragmatism assumes that the human will is autonomous, and if we just find the right psychological sales pitch, we can convince people to change their minds and choose God.
It relies on human effort.
But if we truly believe what Romans 9 teaches, that salvation depends not on human will or exertion, but on God who shows mercy, we do not need to rely on cheap gimmicks.
We are free to rely on the bold, fearless, clear proclamation of the truth. We do not have to manage the outcome. We just have to be faithful messengers.
And if the king's heart truly is an irrigation canal in the hand of the Lord, the believer has absolutely no logical reason to cower before political, cultural, or social opposition.
You can speak the truth with contrite courage in your workplace, in your community, and in your home, knowing that the sovereign Lord governs the minds of those who oppose you.
You are immortal until your God-ordained work on this earth is finished.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, let's summarize the massive amount of ground we have covered today.
We started in the bustling marketplace of James chapter 4.
Learning that human planning is a normal activity, but it becomes a sinful, practical atheism when it is self-sufficient and ignores the Creator.
We moved to the ancient throne rooms of Proverbs 21.
Discovering that the absolute earthly powers, the dictators and the empires, are entirely subject to the divine turning of Yahweh's foot.
Like a farmer directing water in a ditch.
We investigated the internal mechanisms of choice in Romans 9.
Seeing that salvation relies exclusively on God's active mercy, not our own internal desire or external exertion.
Because our natural wills are hostile to Him. And we saw all of this perfectly proven at the cross, where the wicked, uncoerced human choices of Pilate and the mob accomplished the exact, predestined, redemptive plan of God.
The call to you, the listener, is to take a hard inventory of your own heart and your own calendar this week.
Hold your plans, your career goals, and your anxieties with open hands.
When you use the phrase, if the Lord wills, do not let it be a thoughtless verbal titic or a religious cliche.
Let it be a sincere, deeply rooted theological confession that frames your entire worldview.
Repent of the arrogant assumption that you control tomorrow and rest in the immense, unshakable peace that comes from knowing the one who actually does.
And as we close, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over. We have spent a lot of time talking about God's meticulous providence over your willing and acting today. and your anxiety regarding your plans for tomorrow.
But I want you to think back to your past. Look at your own history.
Think about the doors that slam shut in your face. Think about the career opportunities you thought you completely ruined through your own incompetence.
Think about the painful relational detours that felt like massive, agonizing failures at the time.
What if those moments were not interruptions to your life's plan at all? What if they were the precise, unyielding grace of God, actively barricading you from your own destruction, denying your autonomous will, and routing you where He pleased so that you would be where you are today?
The next time you open up that digital calendar on your phone and start blocking out your week, remember who really holds the pen.
Thanks for joining us on Reformed Thinking.